Okay, so this moves us into part two of the elements of data. In this section, I'm going to cover two key issues. First, something called the pastaya that you've probably never heard of before. That's going to be important not only for you to understand how data works, but also to understand how persuasion works later on. And then the second part of today's lecture will be all about visual aids and how you can use presentation aids when you present them to an audience. Now, the classics have to do with something called the pastaya, which is a Greek word that translates to the proofs. And basically what we're looking for here is the three different approaches that you can use to try to reach an audience. There are three of them. The first one is called pathos. Now that looks like pathological, but the better root word there is something along the lines of sympathy or empathy. It has to do with the emotional appeals that are in your speech. This could include things like really cool language choice that invigorates the speech. Could also include visual appeals that make a speech emotionally powerful in terms of sadness or happiness. Any emotion counts as a pathetic appeal. Not pathetic as in a, oh, I feel so sad for you, but pathetic is simply meaning I feel while you give this speech. So remember, not just positive emotions are functioning here. For example, some of you might have seen the Sarah McLachlan advertisements for puppies that are going to be put down. That's obviously a pathetic appeal in both senses of the word. The degree of emotion is important because audiences tend to enjoy emotional appeals, but they don't like it when the emotional appeal is too over the top or too overwhelming. If we get too overwhelmed by an emotional appeal, we might just short circuit and we won't pay attention to what you're actually saying with the rest of the speech. Think about a really over-the-top gory horror movie. If that's not what you're there for, you'll just shut down. You won't actually process what's happening in the scene. Another issue is the variety is important. If the speech has nothing but joke after joke after joke, it becomes really hard to take you seriously. Similarly, if the entire speech is nothing but serious and sad messages, then we kind of lose any hope. So you need to have a good variety of messages. A great example of this is to think back to classic drama, like Hamlet or The Lion King, right? Where we have to start out at a moment of feeling happiness in order for the sad parts to matter and for the eventual victory of our hero to seem powerful as well. So make sure to keep it varied. And the final issue is be aware of the audience's needs or expectations. For some speeches, they're not going to expect you to be funny, so it's not necessary. Similarly, maybe surprising them might be effective. But you have to acknowledge that an audience's needs when it comes to emotions are really important. If the audience needs a laugh and you don't give it to them, even if the speech were flawless in every other respect, you might have trouble. Now the next element is called ethos, and this looks a lot like the word ethics. That's kind of related to it. Ethos has to do with the personal appeals. That's the appeal that the speaker, him or herself, actually brings to the table. This can be good or bad. For example, any of you who are big movie buffs probably know who Michael Bay is. He's a guy who's known for making movies in which a whole bunch of stuff explodes. So the Transformers movies are his movies. Now the problem is that a lot of people, when they watch a Michael Bay movie, probably don't really think of it as a serious movie at all. They think of it as nothing but a whole bunch of stuff going explodey. And that means that it gets hard to take his movies seriously. On the flip side, if Steven Spielberg makes a movie, we're more likely to give him a pass because we know of a long history of making really solid films. So a person's credibility, character, and competence matter. So first, character. Now, character isn't moral character like the person's trustworthy. This simply means they're interesting, like they're a character, they're unusual in some way. That could be either affection, meaning that you think that they're physically attractive or sexually attractive, but it could also just mean that you think they're interesting or fun. When you meet somebody from a foreign country who has an accent, you probably find that person interesting purely because of the accent. That's a character issue. They might be saying stuff that's just the same as anybody else would be saying, but their accent adds a little bit of spice to whatever it is you're doing. That's a character appeal. Credibility is much more about that trustworthiness. The classics version of this would think of a concept called goodwill. And basically what you're saying is, do I think this person has my best interest at heart? A good example would be if you look to me, I'm your teacher. Now I'm being paid to teach you, but it's not like I'm making megabucks. So you can probably trust that what I'm telling you is truthful because I've got your best interests at heart. If I do a good job of presenting this information, you'll end up giving good speeches. And that's what I want for you. So my credibility, hopefully, is pretty solid. Now, competence is a totally different issue. Competence has to do with whether or not the person is good at whatever they're there to do. Some classic examples of this would be people who are great at their job, but terrible in other ways. A lot of people, when it comes to politicians, don't necessarily think they're stupid, which would be a competence issue. It's they think that they're corrupt, which would be more of a credibility issue. Those are the two key things you're looking at. Competence means that the person has game. Credibility means that you trust them and think that they're good-hearted. And character means you find them interesting. So those three elements can definitely add something to a speech. The final one is logos, which is the pure logical appeal of the speech. This is how the arguments work and how the research works within the arguments. Logos, of course, means word in classic Greek. So in the Bible, for example, in the beginning was the word. That's logos. That's the logical content of whatever the argument is actually there to tell us. Now, in classical terms, this was usually viewed as the real argument, what your speech was there to do, either to inform us about something and teach us, or to persuade us. This was the key element. Everything else was seen as decoration. So, on to our first type of evidence, which was physical evidence, and that will also lead into our discussion of visual aids. Now, physical evidence, like artifacts, are things that can be used to illustrate or prove a point because of their physical characteristics. Some of these examples would be physical evidence, like for any of you who are fans of TV shows like CSI, those are artifacts, right? If you find somebody's toenail clipping and it matches their foot, or DNA or hair fibers, these are all physical evidence that can be used to prove a point. But a model is also useful. Some of you might have been in a doctor's or dentist office and actually had them bring over the little sculpture or plastic model of whatever part of your body they were talking about, so they could take it apart and explain to you exactly what they were going to be doing with you or what they were working on. That physical model made it a lot easier for you to understand the processes that we were going through. Demonstrations are also fantastic because they help an audience really feel a moment. I'll never forget a science teacher that I had. He used a lot of his own money in the classroom because he'd retired from the aerospace industry. And we went into his class every day having no clue what he was going to do. One day he had a huge aquarium at the front of the classroom filled with water and nothing else. And without saying a word, he simply takes out this jar of yellow powder and sprinkles it all over the top of the aquarium. Then he pulls up one sleeve and shoves his entire arm down into the water. We can see his hand inside the aquarium. It's covered in yellow paste. He waves around and wiggles his fingers and stuff, and then he pulls his arm out, shakes it once, and it is completely dry. This stuff, called lycopodium powder, made it so that his hand never broke the surface tension of the water, creating like a little mini glove just by pushing his hand through it. That demonstration was so powerful that it still sticks with me all these years later. Just physically showing me something made me curious, and that curiosity made it more likely I was going to pay attention to what he talked about afterwards. Now, visual aids such as charts, graphs, diagrams, layouts, artist representations are also great examples of these. Now, the thing is, they're usually more informative than persuasive. Now, unless the thing you're trying to persuade the audience about is a belief, for example, you'll commonly hear jokes about how people don't really understand geography very well. So when you talk about North Dakota and Seattle, you think of North Dakota as being this, like almost in the Arctic Circle, and Seattle is actually in Washington State, which is equally high up on the globe. But in your mind, they don't appear in, you don't think of them as being as far north as each other. So when you pull out a map, pow, you've been persuaded. But that's more of an informational type of persuasion. It's that I'm changing the way you see the world. I'm not really changing the way you feel about it. When they are persuasive, though, they tend to blow a person's mind, and they can't ever go back to thinking things were the way they were once before. So we're going to focus on the informative quality. That's why I require them in the informative speech, but not in the persuasive speech, because sometimes the persuasive speech just doesn't need them. But if you do want to use a visual aid in the persuasive speech, remember, you can. That's an option available to you. So, as I mentioned in the last set of notes, I want you to keep track not just of the stuff that I've previously talked about, what is an artifact or visual aid, but what are the benefits and disadvantages, what works well and what doesn't work well. So here are some of the benefits. First, they appeal to visual learners, and this is increasingly becoming virtually everybody in society. As our society becomes more and more adapted to screens, we find that more and more students are becoming naturally visual learners, and teachers are getting better at using a visual style to appeal to them. A great example of this was from Sesame Street a long, long time ago when I was watching. They would sometimes have a little guy who would appear and he would actually physically walk past each of the letters in a word. So in my example I've shown you on the screen, a little character would actually walk by the R and say the R noise, rrr, and then he would walk further and say the un, and then finish by saying the ning, and then he would go back and do it again faster. And that physical representation of the reading process, moving from left to right and merging those ideas together, was really powerful for me. They can also appeal to emotion or pathos, because remember, pictures are worth 1,000 words. I could probably tell you a joke or tell you about some old guy who got drunk and did something funny, and that might be interesting or hilarious to you, but it won't work nearly as well as me simply showing you. Boom. There's a guy who was on stage during a performance and suddenly decided he was going to start dancing along with the rest of the folk. And okay, we're feeling a little awkward for him, but we're also feeling kind of funny. It gets better when you find out that this is the former president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. Yeah, he was known to drink a little bit, and this was one of his little experiences that made worldwide news. Now, I could have explained all that to you, and it wouldn't have had nearly the effect of simply watching this old guy get down. They also appeal to logic in that they are very clear. My wife used to be in charge of the tickets back at her old law firm in Seattle, so whenever one of the partners didn't want to go to the basketball game or football game or whatever, we would sometimes get first crack at going to the game for free. Problem is, we often didn't know where we would be sitting. So she would call me and say, "Hey, we've got tickets tonight," and I would say, "Where are they?" And she would say, "Section 114, row D." And I would pull up a bookmark on my computer that showed me Key Arena's layout. 114, ooh, it's off in the corner there. Row D isn't too bad though. That's not ideal seating. And then I would decide, okay, tell me now, who are we playing against? Notice how this visual representation made it really quick and easy for me to find out where we would be in the stadium and how I feel about those tickets. They can also dramatically enhance your ethos, making you look both intelligent, because you've done a good job putting together the visual aids, but also to make it look as though you care about your topic, which is the credibility angle, and they can be interesting, funny, persuasive on their own right, which is a character appeal. So all three elements of ethos could be enhanced with really good visual aids. But as the ... suggests there, it's not all good news. And it's not all good news because one of the first disadvantages of it is that it could really damage your ethos. If you use visual aids poorly, or your visual aids are just ugly or not very useful to begin with, that could really hurt your case. So for example, let's say I had a landscaper coming to my house who was going to be redoing my yard, and he gives me this to indicate his vision for my house. Now, obviously, he wouldn't do that, but imagine what would happen in that conversation. The second he shows me that, I know that he's not serious or he's not qualified, and I boot him immediately. Now, you're not going to turn in anything this bad, but I want to emphasize it by going over the top, that if your visual aids look weak, the audience basically feels the entire presentation is damaged by it. So make sure that if you use visual aids, you choose them well. They can often be difficult to find, make, or present. For example, some of you might not have used PowerPoint before, so what I'm doing here right now might seem like wizardry to you. Those of you who have done PowerPoint before know that this is a pretty basic technique that I'm using, so it's not that amazing. Once you play around with it a little bit, you'll be amazed how quickly you can get good at locating good visual aids and working them into your presentations. Unfortunately, even good visual aids can be a bad thing, because sometimes the visual aid can be so good it overwhelms the speech. My favorite example of this happened back when I was at the University of Washington doing my doctorate, and somebody from Google actually came to talk to us about search engines. And this was before anybody even knew what Google was. What was cool was that as he was giving the speech, he had loaded onto the overhead projector a computer program that showed us every single search that was going through Google while he was talking. Yes, every search, which means, yeah, there were some searches for some sketchy stuff happening up there. And the weird thing is that as cool as that was, it made it impossible for me to pay attention to his speech. Because during his presentation, there was apparently some guy somewhere who was really interested in finding out more about Britney Spears' legs. Because we would see a search for Britney Spears' legs, and the audience would laugh because we all saw that together, and we would be distracted from his speech. And then we would see search after search after search of usual regular stuff, things like mortgage prices and where can I, what are the hours of my local library and stuff like that. But then, without fail, in a couple of minutes, there would be another search for Britney Spears' ankles or Britney Spears' feet. And it derailed the presentation. Every time that happened, it made it impossible to pay attention to what he was talking about. Sometimes you might have audience sizes that also make it hard to use visual aids. For example, the room might be shaped poorly. There might be obstructions where some people wouldn't be able to see it. If you bring in a visual aid by hand, it might be too small, or if you make handouts, there might not be enough of them. This is all a technical concern and can be easily handled if you simply think in advance or ask questions about where you're going to be giving the speech to make sure the technical side is covered. When in doubt, do extra. As I mentioned before, being prepared in advance will make you more comfortable as a speaker. So let's suppose you wanted to give a presentation that used PowerPoint, but when you arrive, either the projector's not working or you're having trouble loading your laptop or having it talk to the projector. Simply having the handouts in your bag would make you feel so much more comfortable and really impress the audience with the amount of preparation you've done. Now, sorry for that sharp transition, but I wanted to do it on purpose to show you exactly how jarring that is. One of the things you've probably noticed is that most of the transitions in my videos have been pretty slow. I'm allowing you time to process, and I'm allowing you time to finish thinking about whatever it is I just finished saying before I move into something new. The same rule is true for visual aids. If I go from saying a story about Google and then pow, there's a fish, that needs some help because the audience is going to be jarred by it. Now what I'm going to be doing in the next several slides is simply showing you some examples of visual aids that have some things that work well for them and some things that don't work well. In my traditional classes, what I would usually be doing is having the audience talk about each of these visual aids so we could kind of generate a list of goods and bads when it comes to choosing presentation aids. So to save you that time, obviously some of the things that work well for this visual aid is it's clear. You can easily read every single word. But the bad news is it's pretty jumbled. There's probably a lot more evidence here than I actually need. So if I were to use this in a real presentation, maybe I would actually use a program like Paint to cover up any of the legend data that I don't need to focus only on the stuff that I do. Similarly, there's not much color, so it's not a terribly visually appealing or emotionally interesting diagram. So maybe I could even highlight the sections I want to focus on using color. These would be some ways that I would improve this visual aid. So think about your own. Here's another one. Okay, this visual aid is colorful, but notice how all of the colors tend to be fairly muted. The only reason I would ever suggest using colors this boring is if it were actually the colors of your company, and therefore would have some kind of identifiable characteristic for the audience. Also notice that the data at the bottom of the screen is a little too small, and two of the colors are so close together for board and dining that it's kind of hard to tell exactly which one's which. In fact, because of the size, even the tech fees bubble down there is hard to spot as being purple. So make sure the colors stand out. That's probably one of the key rules of making good visual aids. By the way, this little graph is something that your PowerPoint projector can actually make for you if you simply open up the insert table or insert diagram. It'll present you with some options about how to put data into a visual aid. All right, we've definitely gone the full spectrum of color here. This one's incredibly colorful, looks very intelligent, looks like a lot of stuff is going on, but again, too much stuff is going on. Also, some of the colors probably wouldn't show up on a projector as well as it's showing up on your screen. For example, if this were projected onto an actual wall, the silty sand, which is the dark blue section down there, those letters probably wouldn't be legible at all to the audience, and even the red sand silty clay might not be legible either. And notice all that small stuff that's all busy on the right-hand side. Unless I'm going to use that during the presentation, it's probably just going to distract the audience and they're going to try to figure out what that stuff is. So again, this visual aid is too busy. The way to handle it would be to cut it into sections. Either get rid of the stuff you don't need or make it into a separate slide so you can come and focus on that other stuff later. Aww. Here we see a great example of the emotional appeal of a visual aid. I pop that up there, immediately the cuddly wonder of a panda bear overwhelms you. But notice that this does nothing else for the speech. There's no logical appeal, and there's certainly no emotional appeal beyond just the awe factor of looking at a panda. So remember, just because it's a visual doesn't mean it's a visual aid. One of the most hilarious speeches I ever had a student do was a student who gave an informative speech about baseball. His visual aid was a baseball. That didn't really do anything for the speech at all. Then, to make it even worse, his buddy got up, one of the other friends of his in the class, to give his speech about baseball, and his visual aid was a baseball glove. And I began to doubt whether or not being a teacher was right for me. But he saved me, because he actually used the baseball glove in his speech. He held up the glove and pointed out the different parts, labeling the features of the glove, and talking about the years in which the different rules have been passed for the different parts of the glove to be added. So, for example, the baseball glove used to be really small, and now it's really big. When did that law get passed? These are all things that he talked about by actually using the visual aid. So if I were to use this visual aid of a panda, I would probably have to focus on things like notice that he's eating bamboo, yet he has teeth that could be used to eat meat. And that's one of the things that scientists still don't understand about the panda bear. Okay, maybe now I've engaged the visual aid a little bit. But again, just because it's a picture doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be useful in your presentation. Here is one of the most common sins of visual aids, and it's one that I have definitely done several times in this presentation because I use so much text. But notice if you make the audience read the entire presentation, there's really no reason for you to talk. Also, it's kind of blurry, maybe a little bit hard to read. The only time I would ever suggest putting up this much text at one time is if the audience had to read it for themselves. A great example of this would be if you were arguing that some contract had some incredibly horrible thing in it, and instead of just convincing us of that, you simply put it up on the screen so we could read it for ourselves. Otherwise, text probably isn't something you want to give us. And if you do give it to us, make sure that the visual comes through more clearly than this one did. And I know what you're thinking. Boy, Shannon has just lost it. We are ending on a totally silly note. Actually, no. This is one of my favorite examples of a visual aid because it shows that the ethos question basically depends on how well you explain the visual aid that you present. If this were my visual aid and I didn't tell you anything about it before I put it up on the screen, yeah, your reaction would be, what kind of refrigerator art is Shannon showing us? But instead, a presentation like this could be made if, before I show you the visual aid, I say, one of the things that was often done in this particular psychiatric program was that people who were patients were encouraged to draw themselves and then draw all of the thoughts that they were having at a given time, especially the ones that made them feel as if there was a pressure on them. Now I've laid the groundwork to explain to you that what you're about to see isn't professional artwork, but it's the real artwork done by a person who's going through one of these therapy programs. Now when I put it up on the screen, the fact that it's poorly drawn doesn't bother you because you understand the ethos. You understand that this is a regular person simply drawing at a regular pace about the things that matter to them. So you jump right past the artwork and probably go directly to reading and beginning to really process the kinds of things that were bothering this person, the kinds of things that were on this person's heart. So remember, when you use a visual aid, the integration, the explanation of why the visual aid is there is so important because it can make a bad visual aid into a good one, and it can make a good visual aid confusing if it's missing. Alright, so here's the bottom line as to how I will grade you on your use of visual aids. If you need a presentation aid, remember, you don't have to have them all the time. You're only required to have one for the informative speech, and you only have to use it at one point during the speech. If you want to use more, you can, and if you want to use them during the persuasive speech, you can. That's totally your call. If you are going to use them, one, make sure those visual aids are good. Don't have any excuses. Don't leave stuff to the last minute. Be sure to practice through it to make sure you're comfortable using the visual aid. Two, integrate it clearly. Explain why the visual aid is there, what we should be taking from it, and practice using it. A common problem students will have when they give a speech is that they'll practice the speech, but they'll forget to practice actually showing us the visual aid. So if you're using a PowerPoint process, actually clicking on the link to make sure that the visual aids come up and go away when they need to, that's a key issue. If you're going to physically show us something, allowing time in your speech to present it to us. Having a visual aid stand, all these things matter. So make sure you integrate the presentation aid into your speech well. And then third, make sure it goes away when you don't need it. If it's a good visual aid, we're going to continue focusing on it. So show it to us only when it's necessary, and then get rid of it as soon as you're done using it. So these are the rules for presentation aids, and that's also the element on data, so we're through part 2. Moving into part 3 is much more about strict factoids, and that's where we'll go next.